To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me.
All right, so we ended on the question of what could the information sphere look like for a transition and an effective move into game B. And before we go into what this actually might look like, let's define what you think of when you think of information sphere. What's that thing for you?
Yeah, what I think of is a good version of what we think of as social media, uh, chat, text messaging, etc., messaging apps, but ones that are generative to the social transition and the human well-being and not exploitive. Unfortunately, for many years now, frankly, ever since advertising became a significant economic driver, and now it's the dominant economic driver for online, the motivations and incentives for the people who operate these systems has been turned on their head. In the early days of the internet, where things were either free or you got charged for them, there was an alignment, right? That you got value, and the provider, had an incentive to give you value in return for being paid, or because they were doing it as a hobby or a philanthropic activity. But once around 2001, 2002, when the costs of networks and computing became cheap enough that you could make a profit with just advertising, the dynamic switched and the systems became grossly exploitive. And some part of what's wrong with our world can probably be traced to that.
Mhm. And I would add to the question of the business model also the very conscious design and monitoring of the quirks the tech brings with it, right? Like, for example, the sycophancy that we experience with many of the large language models, which might have devastating consequences on a societal scale as well, because everybody thinks that they are the world-class expert on a specific topic that they actually don't know very much about just because the machine has told them so. And similar things for endless scroll and thumbs up, which are really nice design ideas, but nobody ever thought through the second order consequences or third order consequences of those. So next to the business model, there's also the complexity of unintended consequences.
Yeah, the user interface, and the two are related, right? Because if your business
Mm-hmm.
model is advertising, then your UX is optimized for holding you in, rather
Mm-hmm.
than giving you what you want and you be on your way. But there's also, even if, let's say, it was a world where people paid $5 a month, um, there might still be these kinds of user interface issues that make the
Mm-hmm.
systems, more addictive than they ought to be, or distracting, or the thumbs up. People become attention whores in ways that are probably not beneficial. I was thinking about that yesterday. That our online world is dominated by it's got a power law distribution, so there is a long tail, but a lot of it is now being dominated by people with millions of followers and what have you, and the power of those big numbers is visible to everybody. So we now have a new hierarchy of attention gathering, which does
Mm-hmm.
not strike me as particularly useful. And an infosphere, needs to consider those things. The business model, UX attributes, and it needs to be designed for specific roles and usages. In particular, I find an awful lot of what is out there today is ephemeral. It's the flow of jabber and gossip and celebrity, and it's kind of been curious that the idea of building an online home for a group of people or for an activity is still not very well supported. I mean, yes, you have specialty things like Basecamp and, to some degree, Slack can be used for that, but none of them are very good, really. And so the online InfoSphere should also include electronic homes for groups. I think of guilds as a good example, right? Where is the Knitters Guild or the Potters Guild or the Seed Savers Guild? Such things exist on Reddit to some degree, but again, the Reddit's got serious UX issues. And then the fourth part is the repositories of knowledge. The reusable, forkable repositories of knowledge. Those things are scattered all over the internet. There isn't any central or well-indexed way to find, for instance, the accords for a cooperative restaurant in Nebraska that has really worked well as an example of cooperative governance. If you could have their governance model available to fork and use for your own restaurant, but of course with modifications, probably, then the collective learning of this high-dimensional search through living space can go much faster. Biological evolution is slow because it has to be an accumulation of mixing and mutation. It takes many, many generations. Humans and culture and language give us a huge advantage, is that we can discover what works and we can copy it. Copy it with modification, and then see how that works. And then if that works, more people will copy that. They may make some additional modifications that make it better, etc. And if we get that infrastructure right, Game B will have a really significant advantage in search and efficacy and at least partial convergence towards what really works.
Okay.
And as far as I know, nobody's ever tried to design such a thing.
Well, you started 13 years ago, and that's where I wanted to go now. And let's look into three perspectives on that stack that you're maybe envisioning. The first, what did you start doing in 2013, right? Around that. And then the second perspective, given the current stack of things we have available to us, like GitHub and LLMs and all of that, how would you pull them together into a functioning model of an InfoSphere for Game B? And then the third layer might be, what would be the absolute dream version? If you could build from scratch without constraints, what would be that dream version of the Game B InfoSphere stack? Right. Let's look at these three layers independently for a couple of minutes to figure out what we're talking about.
All right, let's tackle it. Let's start with the first. In 2013, we decided as part of the very early Game B effort to build something called LightNet, which would be our online home. We had been using Basecamp and we weren't too happy with it. It sort of worked, but it was not the greatest. And we also wanted something that we could open up to larger groups of people, and that it would have sort of a fractal structure and would be horizontally scalable. We looked at the systems that were out there, and we concluded that the closest analog was Reddit, with its ability to go horizontal. And so in those days, Reddit was open source, believe it or not. So we took a fork of the Reddit source code, modified it quite substantially, and used that as the basis for LightNet. We added things like, amazingly, in those days, Reddit didn't have avatars, right? Or you couldn't load your image up. So we added that. Also, search did not search responses. It only searched the original post. That may still be the case. I don't know. But we created a different full text search backend that searched the whole thing. And then as we talk about fractalness, Reddit itself really only has one level of subreddits, basically, is how it spreads horizontally. And there can be some loose families of subreddits, but we built in some architectural components. The first of which was quite easy, was links to neighbors, so that if there were two groups, what the hell did we call them? Spaces, I think we called them. Was what our name for what were called subreddits. If two spaces agreed, then links would appear on the right side of the display that had a friend link, basically, to a group, a space that essentially. Again, the idea of this was it would be an emergent way to create a network of networks. And then the last feature we actually added before we abandoned the effort was something called houses. This was a very clever idea created by a guy named Curtis Faith, one of the early startup members of the Game B effort. And the idea of houses was kind of like tribes. And that they would have, today we'd call them accords. The house would have a statement of its values, essentially, and what it was about. And a space could join a house. And each house had a flag of, like, kind of European style flag with horizontal lines laid out across vertical lines laid out across a horizontal surface. So you could be purple, yellow, green could be your house flag. And any space that considered itself a member of that house, you could only be a member of one house. That may have been a design flaw, I don't know. Could fly the flag of that house. And then there were sort of implied access rules and things that were inherited across houses. So, we gave a fair bit of thought to it. We also added and I think about it on this idea of spaces for groups to do things. We added collections of files, which Reddit still doesn't have, amazingly. At that time, Reddit had a rudimentary wiki built into Substacks. I don't even think it exists anymore, but we highlighted that and made it more of a first-class object so that every space could have its own wiki. Now, there was not a very powerful wiki, but it was something. So anyway, that's what we did, and it's surprisingly unsuccessful.
Why? What's your learnings from that phase?
I think that and I would say pretty clear to me in retrospect, that the Reddit UX is way too masculine. Women do not like it. In particular, women do not like downvoting. They don't mind upvoting, but they don't like downvoting, and they don't want to post where their posts might be downvoted. And so we found that we disproportionately male in membership and even more so in activity. And that was one thing. The other thing was that, and this is a warning to anyone who's trying to build a broad-based network. For one of these networks to work, it has to become a central part of someone's life. I call it a nexus of attention. And there is nothing more difficult to build than a new nexus of attention in the online world. If we think about nexuses of attention, the first one was email. Email, people started paying attention to their email sometime in the mid 80s probably, and then more so into the 90s. So it became a nexus of attention. Text messaging became a nexus of attention later. Facebook became a nexus of attention, at its peak. it was amazing the percentage of people that if you're the best way to contact them was via Facebook. Twitter is a much smaller nexus of attention, but for a significant number of people, a few 100 million. Then we have things which aren't really communications platforms, things like TikTok, that become nexus of attention for people. And so to achieve nexus of attention, there is some magic about the benefit, the ease of use, the nature of the experience, the content available that tips you over into being an everyday user of a platform. And we never really achieved, maybe achieved that for a group of 15 or 20 people, but it never expanded to the full group of a couple of hundred of members that we had at that time. I think that part of it is that we probably mistakenly overestimated the number of people who actually are looking for something like that. There's a reason that not everybody's on Facebook or Twitter, and it may well be then that the early Game B crew was disproportionately people who did not want yet another online service. And there wasn't enough compelling content on it other than self-created content to be a strong attractor. So we failed to reach or even feel like we were coming close to reaching the nexus of attention. In retrospect, we probably could have solved that eventually, but after flogging it for about 8 or 9 months, we pulled the plug on it. It just didn't seem like it was happening. But it was an interesting attempt. I think I learned a number of things. First is you got to think about a UX that appeals to both men and women. I think that's hugely important. I think you also have to populate, find groups who want homes. And there are lots of groups looking for homes. Nobody's happy with their online homes that I've talked to. There's people on mighty networks. There's people who use Facebook groups. There's people who use subreddits, et cetera. But people use Basecamp still. I don't know what the other new alternatives are, but I'm sure there's a bunch. Nobody's too happy. And so finding groups, and talking to them in some detail about what is it they're looking for, and implement group homes that do that, and then recruit some group homes in early, I think is important. And it's funny. I've always been interested in this, and so I've sort of been giving advice or talking to various people that have various, or who build, particularly the group support online services, and it's maddeningly difficult. None of them succeed, even though there's clearly a need and a libido. Part of it's a needle in the haystack problem. These affinity groups are spread far and wide, and it's very hard to communicate to them in mass. So it's hard to get the word out, and their needs are different. And they are and also those groups themselves tend to be transient. They don't necessarily last for a long time. So it's a difficult problem. We had a great little team of developers. We had 4 people working on it, and we had a great group of people thinking about the design and participating and providing real-time feedback and stuff. But we still didn't even come close to succeeding.
Okay. So it's a mixture of the interface and also the cold start problem. How do you solve for the cold start problem? And maybe interlinked with that the business model. So
fortunately, this one didn't have a business model problem in that we funded it. We got some philanthropic grants to fund it, so we did not have to have a supportive business model.
Which potentially also might have been the flaw. Who knows?
It's possible.
Maybe there's a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Now, I will say I have since then leaned towards paid subscriptions. But unfortunately, it's so against the trend of the internet. People want free. there's a book a guy named Chris Anderson wrote, the Chris Anderson of TEDx or TED, called Free, which basically made the argument that if you can't make your service free, you're going to lose, because consumers love free. And it produces horrific side effects, like Facebook, for instance. The amount of gross profit it gets out of the advertising from its average user is like $2 a month. All right, so all the psychic harm that comes from the Facebook business model, they're fighting over $2, maybe $3 a month. Twitter's less, more like 50 cents a month per user. And all the corruption that comes from that business model is about a tiny amount of money. Now, in the old days, it was more expensive to run these platforms than it is today, but these platforms are cheap enough to run at scale that you could charge $2 or $5 a month and they'd run just fine. But the fact is, we had a trajectory when things were more expensive and more difficult that sucked us into the free model. And free is just so attractive. You don't have to put any credentials up, take any new risk by putting your credit card information out. It's a serious barrier to business model innovation, I would say.
Okay, let's hop to today. And because there's a lot of things that hadn't been built or hadn't been experimented with in 2013 that are now solved, evolved, or built into existence. How would you put together a platform today? What would be the components that you would pick and choose? Because back then you used Reddit, but if you could just pick and choose of the current ecosystem of online services, what would you take?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I should also warn that, unlike in 2013, I am no longer saturated in what the state of the art is. At that time, I signed up for every new service just to check it out, and I don't do that much anymore. In fact, I'm not using any online stuff at the moment. I famously take a 6-month social media sabbatical every year from July 1st to January 2nd. And this year I decided not to come back, right? So I've just said, fuck all that shit. Life's too short to be arguing with morons on the internet. And I don't really, and the small group stuff that I do is pretty much exclusively done either on Signal or email. And so I do think that that is something to consider, that, the business model and the whole experience of the open networks has not turned out to be very pretty, contrary to what some of us pioneers thought. We thought we were doing the Lord's work, that this would make citizenship better, politics more sane, people more happy and well-adjusted, and we were wrong about that. And so I'm not sure any of the major platforms are good indicators at all. But some of the features, I think, are still some of the same ones that we built into LightNet. I think you do want lots of propagation, lots of horizontal, separate groups, spaces, subreddits, whatever. It would be nice for them to be able to be organized hierarchically, which is something you don't see in very many systems. There's a very interesting little system called Wiko, worth checking. I've helped fund them some over the years, and it is a natural, hierarchical, fractal online environment with many cool features. Hadn't taken off at all. They've had some groups come on to it. WECO.
Okay.
And it may be that the UX is too intellectually abstract or not efficient enough or something, because you can build arbitrarily nested spaces one within the other. You can build links between them. I mean, intellectually and conceptually, it's really interesting. But, they brought several groups on, and it's been, no great success each time. And I've told them that if they could ever show a group of a couple of thousand that were actually working successfully on Weka, it would be worth going out and raising some money and going for it. But no, never happened. So that's a warning that even interesting, elegant UX isn't necessarily a product market fit. And I don't have good intuitions anymore. For instance, I know that today almost everything is done on apps, phone apps. I don't use phone apps, very seldom. I try to avoid phone apps. I use Uber and very few others. And so I have no good intuitions about mobile first design. And I'm saying that, so I'm not a good person necessarily to try to figure out what ought to be in a service for today. But the same kinds of support, I think, is necessary. The horizontal spreading, the hierarchical aggregation, all bottoms up, if at all possible. I think one big thing we have today, we didn't have in 2013, is the easy ability to build video video conferencing. In fact, Mighty Network, something we have the Game B back-end system on, does have a nice integration with Zoom, for instance. You can add to the calendar a group Zoom or a small group Zoom or an open to the public Zoom. And that's really nice. And I would say that I've long said that the downside of the current InfoSphere is that it produces weak links as opposed to strong links. Person to face-to-face produces the strongest links, but video produces stronger links than pure online. And so building interactive video into the platform, I think, is very helpful in strengthening the network. For instance, the live video that Reddit has added, not Reddit, Twitter has added recently, I think is an interesting design idea. So that if you have a group, the word can be every Saturday, we have an open channel. Anybody wants to pop in can and talk about whatever they want. Okay, go ahead.
I was going to go to different technological buckets. Like, what are your thoughts around all of this, specifically regarding distributed ledger systems? So my mind always goes, when I think about that kind of stack, towards immutability and an elegant way to protect the knowledge that's in there. For example, the shared knowledge about how to implement things, but also, of course, the accords. So that's one bucket, and then the other bucket, of course, is the big large language model bucket, which can alleviate some of the pressures of formalized data collection, and synthesize new forms into that whole thing and throughout that whole thing. So, what are your thoughts around these? How would you integrate, or would you integrate them at all? Do you think they're relevant or not?
Now, I will say I have always resisted using Bitcoin, Ethereum style blockchains in any such system, because they're slow and complicated, and they don't really add any value other than trustlessness. And it seems to me that if you have to have trustlessness in your platform, then there's something wrong with your culture. Especially because the cost of this trustlessness is so extreme in terms of performance and ability to create things that I have long resisted the general purpose use of cryptographic ledgers as a back end for anything that's heavily transactional. In terms of immutability, we have a very nice solution for that. GitHub, right? You can, for instance, put all your accords up on GitHub, and they're immutable. Every change produces a new version. People can go back and track the changes. And so a model like that, I think, is much more interesting.
But they're quite mutable on a hardware level, right? So if Microsoft doesn't like the Accords, they can go to the physical service and log in and delete, right? So
yeah, that's true.
That's why that's the background of my question for immutability through distributed ledger systems, like the distributed database things that people have built on top, that are slow. You're right, but as a backup system, so that you can reboot once somebody has taken a data center offline for some reason. You can reboot in a new data center and run.
I've often said that one, to my mind, good use case for the immutable blockchain is for an audit trail, right? Or the ability to recover, where you don't expect real time or near real time stuff to be done in the blockchain, but all the transactions that matter are basically written out in a stream that anybody can take and preserve however they want, whether it's just multiple copies or whether they want to put it on a distributed ledger. That's up to them. But a distributed ledger is fine for that kind of thing. Where it's not good is for any kind of read-write transactions. And anything, it's not even slow. It's worse than slow, basically. And it's like, what the fuck, right? They weren't designed for that, which is they've been pushed way beyond what they were designed for. And now, of course, they have all kinds of L2 and L3 networks and stuff to try to work around it. But then then you have a new problem, right? Who do you trust to operate the L2 and L3 networks? And sure that the infrastructure is correctly designed. So there's all kinds of new risks involved. I could see using, digital trustless networks as a backup modality. It's a good point that, Microsoft could decide they wanted to shut down GitHub for some reason. And if everything of interest to our community has been distributed on a immutable, unattackable, at least until quantum computers get here, blockchain, then, that would be a good thing.
Okay. What about large language models? Because that's a definite new nexus, right?
Yeah, very new and very powerful. And I don't think we've fully conceptualized its real sweet spots yet. I think its most obvious power is as a curation tool. If you have a substantial network, one of your problems is finding or being alerted to the fact that something you might be interested in has appeared. And it seems to me that LLMs, but probably not just raw LLMs, but and related technologies like collaborative filtering, etc., could be used, for instance, to get you your own daily news briefing about what's going on in the network. That's sort of an obvious thing, and yet no network that I'm aware of does that very well. The feeds on the social media platforms aren't to produce what I want. They're to produce what they think will keep me engaged. And so I think the LLMs can do a really good job on things like that if they're implemented in good faith and for the good of the user, not for the good of the platform. And that's the risk. And that risk is taking off.
You had a guy on the podcast who built something that I think was called Midnight Protocol, but it wasn't open yet. Have you been tracking that? Because it proposed something very interesting, which was that agents would, on behalf of humans, meet each other, and if there was a match of some kind of interests or reciprocity, they would come back and alert the humans.
That was an interesting idea. Unfortunately, he dropped it fairly quickly. It was he couldn't really conceptualize how to get it to market. the critical mass startup problem, etc. And I will also say he's a good friend of mine, but he's become so enamored. He's a non-programmer, but a very excellent product manager. And he's just gone nuts, becoming his own developer with Claude Code and things. And actually, I think anti-gravity is the main one he uses. It's a Google tool. And every 2 weeks when he and I sync up and have our little chat, he's completely changed what he's working on because it's so easy, right? He's very creative, comes up with an idea, can implement it in 3 days, and then 3 days later he realizes, oh no, that won't work, and he just ditches it. And he's on to the next thing. So that one, that was a flash in the pan. That one lasted probably about 3 weeks, so that was longer than usual. But the idea is a good one. And Jordan Hall also has long advocated that a matching network for people and projects could be a very strong attractor in this info space area. You can say, I'm looking for a person to write me a piece of theme music for my podcast, and if it could be from a context of trust and reputation and well understood good faith ground rules, then it could be really powerful. But again, like any such two-sided network, there's substantial startup problems. You probably can't implement that as the first service. You got to find a critical mass on something else.
Yeah.
But
David Hodgson is trying to do that with mycelial.earth, I think it's called, at the moment, where he brings together.
Who's trying to do that?
David Hodgson. He's in San Francisco and he's building mycelial.earth.
Yeah, David Hodgson,
yeah. And so, what happens there? The group that he has onboarded onto the platform is probably just sufficiently big, because I get a weekly introduction to somebody, and every other week it's somebody I already know, right? So, but the hit quote is really good. So the quality of the connections is actually amazing. So again, also there you need to find a way to grow this quickly so that it maintains value.
It's called mycelium.
Mycelial.earth.
Mycelium. Okay, mycelium.
Mycelial.
I'll see if I can track it down.
Yeah,
email me a link to it if you would. I know David from a long time ago. He's been a social change guy since forever.
Yeah, maybe you should get him to talk about it.
I'll check it out.
So, here you go. Just sent it. Okay. The other reason why I was asking towards the distributed ledger system is there have been experiments with the decentralized autonomous organization. We know that, but there's a group called Haifa who has started working on what they call the decentralized human organization. So basically saying, okay, this whole tech layer needs to be in service of humans and what they want to achieve with it, not the other way around. They have consistently over the last 7 years been iterating and currently are at their version 3 of the Haifa stack, an enabling layer that provides the fractality that you were referring to, right? The multidimensional spawning of new subgroups or side groups, and that might be interconnected or not, with a very clever approach and on a distributed system. So that might be an interesting component as well.
Yeah, I believe I talked to them years ago. They've been around for like 5 or 6 years.
7, yeah.
7. What's the head guy's name?
Ronnie Patel and Alex Prate, or Prate. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
I don't know. That's the guy I talked to. I'll look into it. But yeah, I've talked to a few people that have projects like that. And every one of them I thought had the failure mode that it was built deeply on top of Ethereum typically. And as soon as I saw that, I go, won't work. Sorry. Or if it will, it'll take 20 times longer than it should. But maybe that because everything about dealing with those networks is hard. Though I will say, I have, again, unfortunately not been able to look into this, is the near elimination of the cost of programming may have changed that. That's something that's very interesting, is that these things are historically were hard and expensive. When I was building online services in the 80s, you couldn't do anything for less than $1 million, right? And you'd figure you needed 5 million to get something to profitability. That was in the 80s. That was real money. It'd be equivalent of 15 million today, approximately. A lot of that was software development. In those days, we had to build our own data centers, even, which kind of sucked. Our own our pre-internet connections. And now, of course, you have AWS, you have the various cloud servers, and now you have the gross reduction of the software development costs with the AI programming tools. And so the focus is now on the UX and the product design, which doesn't require as many people, but requires more talent, probably. So it's now a talent-centric in development environment to get the brain trust of people who've been doing this stuff and thinking about it the longest, and cook down what is it that we really need, and I don't know how we do that, but
let's take that and take your. I mean, there's nobody on the planet who has more like in terms of time, longer experience of building social networks than you, right? You started building this first social network in the 80s, and you were still at it in 2013, at least. And so if you could, without constraints, maybe because now one of the major constraints of the implementation talent has gone away, dream up the absolute best possible platform. What would that look and feel like for a game be?
Yeah, I really don't. I can't see it. I'm over the hill. I'm going to admit it, right? If you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I would have gone on and on and on. But I just don't feel like I have a good feel for UXs, and particularly, I don't really understand how mobile fits into all these things. And
all right, but so from a functional perspective, what? So you said horizontal. Scaling and fractality, but also depth. You said
each of these spaces needs to have a data repository, a file repository, a link repository, a membership list, etc. So these things need to be thicker than, let's say, a Facebook group or most of the subreddits, or at least have the opportunity to become thicker if there's desire within the group for that. I guess I'm not quite as over the hill as I thought, because there are some other things that I think about that we've messed with and had trouble with. The other one that bites a huge amount of these online groups, in particular in the ass, is a lack of a governance modality. Right? What happens when somebody is a really bad actor and you need to do something about it? If you haven't built in some form of governance modality, it often turns that into a crazy political battle internally, and without any obvious form of resolution, until a dictator appears. And I've told many of these people that are working on these systems that if it was me and I was building an online community of communities from scratch, the first thing I'd build in is a governance layer for the groups that they can not a fixed template. Facebook does have a governance modality, which is it has an owner, administrators, and moderators that have different powers. And now it wasn't well designed, so it's got some serious, crazy logical problems with it. But at least they have a minimal governance thing. But would be much, much better would be a formal governance structure that you could cook in and set different settings on it for each group. And that would, get, and I would say now using our newer Game B concept of accords, a way to implement the accords in code, essentially, or ways to activate and turn into reality what we'd agreed to in the accords with actual affordances in the system. And, typically that comes down to things like banning people or putting them on a timeout, deleting certain kinds of content, specifying what kinds of content are germane, should self-promotional stuff be allowed or not, those governance, and this is the same issue I've thought about the Game B membranes, is that a random group of people trying to invent a governance modality is on average going to do a bad job. And so the idea of templates and reusable, forkable governance modalities, I think would be a huge help in that, all right, you are 100 people have come together to do X, and you know a lot about X, but you don't know anything about governance. And just because you know a lot about X doesn't mean you know anything about governance. And so I would put as much thought into what the governance layer should look like as I could before I started bending any metal. Because it turns out these things have deep implications for everything about the design. And so, I would think about governance from very early.
Okay. And wouldn't that point again in the direction of a distributed ledger system that has also some level of enforcement of contracts already built in place, especially Ethereum?
Could be. I got to say, I am leery of immutable contracts. And it's one of the reasons DAOs have mostly failed, in my opinion, is that if you look at a human culture, the accords are constantly changing, right? If you work at a company, the formal rules change periodically, but the culture changes even more rapidly than that. In a polity, the laws change and the norms change and the personnel changes. DAOs in general are too rigid. It's too hard to change the contracts. And in fact, in many of the early DAOs, you couldn't at all, right? You had to get the design right from the get-go. And the chances of humans getting the design right on some cooperative complex venture are almost zero. And so the supposed benefit of the DAO, all right, it's immutable, nobody can change the agreements we've made, turns out to be a flaw in that you need to be able to learn and adapt and negotiate and come up with compromises, etc., the way humans have always done. I'm sure a group of hunter-gatherers sitting around the fire regularly had disagreements and regularly came up with a human negotiated settlement that left everybody approximately equally unhappy, but in a good enough state to continue to cooperate and hang together as a group. And so I think those issues need to be front and center in the design of the governance system. And again, when you say distributed ledgers, immutable, et cetera, it doesn't have to be, of course. You can put anything on a ledger, because ledger really isn't anything other than a database. Databases could just be a recording of what you've agreed to, but it seems to be an attractor towards trying to get the enforcement mechanisms built into the smart contracts in a way that tends to be too rigid and does not evolve as we discover what we're really trying to do. You've done ventures, you know that when you start a company, you have a vision, and what you actually do is never that, right? At least never exactly that. And so mutability, evolvability have got to be central to thinking about governance.
Okay. We want them to evolve. We want them to fork. We want them to integrate easily into life in a tangible, as tangible possible way. So at least video, if not an actual fire to sit around. Um, so currently something, I mean, if I were to dream up something now, I would um, extensively use the help of recording basically everything that happens in a group setting, in any of these group settings, and then with the help of machines, help us synthesize what came out of that conversation in a neutral way. We were there a couple of conversations ago where we had a neutral observer, right? The person
Fair
or the
witness.
machine,
Yeah.
yeah, the fair witness. So that kind of modality, but also um, the critical comparison of what is happening inside of the group against the group's own accord to play back whether the group is still adhering to their own accord or whether there needs to be a negotiation happening around that and what the consequences might be right now to off the breach of contract already, right? So things like that. So administrative helper functions that I would embed extensively so that there could be some, at least some mirror mechanism provided by the machinery.
Yeah, and I think that could be interesting because these are things that we often build and then forget.
Hmm.
All right, we've set this thing in motion and we don't come back and make the adjustments as often as we could. It may well be that we could build AI assisted tools that look for deviations from our accords and maybe even suggest modifications to
Hmm.
them and front to the community, hey, there's a divergence between what you said you want to do and what you're actually doing. So either change what you say you want to do or do what you said you were going to do or something in between.
Hmm.
I think LLMs could have some traction in that space, in that space, probably quite a bit.
Well, I'm extrapolating from what I see several people around me doing at the moment, which is using uh, open code or OpenClaw or even Claude code to create personal assistants who um, have a set of characteristics. One of them even calls it that person's soul. So there's a soul MD file for that. And that soul evolves over time, right? So it deepens, it becomes much more complex over time. And according to him, it actually reflects the behavior of that assistant. Um, and what would happen if we think that further into group settings, right? If a group created an assistant which is essentially an instantiation of an accord, but in a kind of like a almost living form, which then everybody co-uses in all of their contexts, so that there's a binding element that has the ability to be context independent, can be permeating all contexts of everybody in that group.
Yeah, and I actually know someone who's working on an explicitly game B network at the moment, actually.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one of the things he's done, taking advantage of LLMs, is that LLMs are pretty good at handling free-form text. And so you
Hmm.
don't have to reduce your accords to legalisms. Any
Hmm.
text can be an accord, even if it is
Hmm.
ambiguous and a
Hmm.
little ambiguous. And that you could then prompt the LLM that's monitoring to say, all right, these are what we have stated. Keep in mind, this is not legal language. This is not algorithmically pure, but this is a text we've all agreed upon. And
Hmm.
apply this text as our intent. And in some ways, I believe that's a better fit for what humans are actually capable of doing, without professional help and lots of expense and lots of argument. And even worse, just like the famous click wrap contracts on software, once agreements are turned into legalese, nobody's going to take the time to read them. And if they do, they're not going to understand them. So there's a benefit, and I think LLMs can help with this tremendously, of turning agreements or accords into plain English, and also encourage people to write these agreements as plain English, with the LLMs having the job of applying them and interpreting them. That's an interesting idea. I like that.
And instant feedback, right? The constant,
Yep.
the constant lawyer sitting inside of the group, raising a hand whenever there's something that comes that has relevance around the accord.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting design space. It'll be a lot of fun to start prototyping something like this. And again, in this era of free code and like every possible back end available as a service, it's probably not that big a project to do. Weeks, probably.
Yeah. And between you and me, we already know about 10 people probably who would be fired up of doing it. So I'm curious who's gonna do it first. But still, it doesn't solve the cold start problem. I think you're totally right about the actual talent that is required is the product development skill, not the software engineering, but the designing the product in such a way that people will actually use it because it fits neatly into their demand and what they're willing to do landscape, right? And that it actually can hit a nexus. So it has to be as frictionless as possible and deliver exactly the benefits people need, which might not be aligned with what the world needs, which makes it more difficult.
Of course, that's always an issue, and one of the fundamentals of human social behavior is the tension between what's good for the group and what's good for the individual. And that's never going to go away. That's sort of built into the nature of the universe. But, things like culture and accords can reduce that gap and, produce better alignment, but will always be there, right? What's in it for me is going to be, even if it's only unconscious, part of the decision on whether you make something a nexus of attention. Am I getting enough out of this to be worth the effort I put into it? And particularly the opportunity cost. What else could I be doing with my time and my attention? Of course, unfortunately, today the answer is watch TikTok. Right? Hopefully we can beat that, but maybe not. Those guys are mighty clever at figuring out what appeals to the deep lizard brain.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it is a doable project probably to find a group of a dozen people who have been thinking about this and probably like me have tried and failed in these things, but who have good cultural feelings for what would work right now. Because I think back at the first before social networks thing called Participate, which we put up in 1982 on the source, and it was a huge success, but it would not be a huge success today because it was filling a void that did not exist. So even if it had issues, the fact that it was the only thing of its sort in the world meant that people who like that kind of thing would see it and go, "Holy shit!" And it worked. But today, you brought that thing up, and people would go, "What? Way too complicated, way too ugly, etc." But the learnings from those kinds of things could be useful in thinking about what we need here in 2026. 2027, 2028, might be a very interesting project. I
get a sense that good.
Let me just make one point here. As I say, I'm an old fogey, used to designing things in the old days. One of the things I do find somewhat disconcerting is an awful lot of product development these days, extremely narrow. It's an app that does X, or it's a thingy that does Y. And I can understand the venture advantage of that. You get it out quickly, you find product market fit, or you don't, and you either win or you lose within less than a year. But to do something like we're talking about is not a simple one app kind of thing. It's a relatively large and both complicated and complex system of which the emergent dynamics are not clear. And so it's got to be a project that people can commit to for a period of time and has funding for it to go long enough to figure enough of these things out to actually achieve nexus of attention status.
Hmm. So what I'm going to say next is going to freak everybody who's in Germany specifically and the data protection people out entirely. But what I really think is that we should step away from the screen entirely when we think about this kind of solution and tap into only for video interaction if real world interaction is not possible, but ultimately prioritize conversation that is continuously recorded and integrated into your various contexts. And about 10 years ago, I asked parts of my software engineering team to build something like that for me. It was a bit too early, so it was prohibitively intense to build this. But today, that's actually quite easy. And everybody has the devices on them to do this at all times. So, what I envision in my inner eye is, in front of my inner eyes, anything from sitting around the literal campfire and talking things through, to sitting around a dinner table, to sitting at a meeting at an office, a context-aware machine that gives us that integrates what is happening with the accord that fits that context, and then manages to also fit across accords and help us with the scouting of potential solutions that occur that we know required in the field in those different contexts that might come from somewhere entirely different, right? So do cross connections across entire big networks.
Yeah, the other thing that would address is, and we both have done this before, been involved in very interesting conversations where a very interesting idea comes up, but then it moves on, right? And the idea is just left hanging. If we could feed all of that into a mega brain and say, there was this little gem that was talked about for 5 minutes and then never spoken of again, maybe we should reconsider the implications of this particular interesting idea. And as you know, you can, in fact, I even bought one. I've never taken it out of the box, but I guess that shows you, my reluctance. One of those things that you put on your shirt and records everything that happens around you. So the technology exists. I just saw an ad for a program for the Mac that will record everything that goes on your Mac and will, feed it into LLMs, et cetera, or file it away in a database, et cetera. So as you say, it's doable today. The question is it desirable, and in what context, in what trust network is it?
Correct.
Is it doable?
And then this to wrap this up with the question around business models, because I would not be happy to do this putting that microphone pin on in every context in my life if the back end of that microphone was owned by somebody who is rent seeking, right? Profit maximizing. I think this needs to be actual commons infrastructure owned by the people, for the people, built by the people for the people. That's the only way we can afford to do something like that. And for somehow we need to manage to make it, um, if not free, then at cost, at such a low entry point that everybody can actually afford it.
Yeah, I would agree. And that, interestingly, might be part of how to get to the double critical mass problem, the cold start problem.
Yeah.
If you could get a reasonable number of people to contribute, their continuous stream of thought into a commons that would be protected in some ways, but would be shareable and reusable in others. Getting that balance right is going to be tricky. But that could grow to be valuable without a big network. If the
That's true.
100 smartest people I know recorded all their conversations and fed them into a data commons, shit, that would be extremely valuable.
Yeah, and that's doable tomorrow. And here's
I mean,
another
hell,
one. Here's another good idea. That's one gem that.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Hey, we've recorded all these conversations, and I now use them in LLM work. I have projects set up with the recording all of our transcripts as the project materials. Nice. That's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. But that brings me back to one gem that we found one day, and which prompted you to say, let's speak with Larry Page about this. And I think what we just found, we should also speak with Larry Page about. So let's try and speak with Larry Page about these two gems that we already have, because this actually organizing all world's knowledge was at the beginning of Google, and organizing the best possible knowledge into a commons might be something for a next phase for somebody like Larry Page.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I don't know what he's really up to these days, but I do think he's more involved with Google right now than he's been in the past.
Yeah.
But
understandably so.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, before we go here, just a little noodling would be fun. We're actually having a little Game Bee gathering in Stanton on Wednesday.
Oh, wow. Cool.
First time
That's nice.
in a long time. And it's just by chance that Jordan and Vanessa wanted to come up to Stanton for a few days. And so we kind of impromptu put a dinner party together of a relatively small number of people that are still in the area. And I don't know what will come out of the conversation. Maybe nothing, may just be social. But it might be more than that. And Jordan and I are going to do a 2-hour brain jam the afternoon before the dinner. And, whether he and I have just gone too far apart, but, he and I have chatted quite a bit, from time to time, even after his conversion. So I do not sense we've gotten too far apart. But any thoughts you might have of, baits to throw upon the water for a Game Bee gathering, conversations with Jordan, etc.?
Well, I mean, the first and probably most intense that comes up is the question of the thing that. So there are two things that religion solves for Jordan, right? It's the assumption that this long-term arc has already solved a bunch of stuff, and it's worth tapping into that. But the other one is the communal aspect and the binding that all gives. And
actually, I think I've extracted. I'm going to ask him about this, but I think I may have figured out what the real attraction is, and it's neither of those things. It's that it is a pre-built trust network, that the trust amongst the members, particularly of a Protestant style, relatively small church, which turns out to be about the Dunbar number on average, maybe 2x the Dunbar number, is way higher than typical trust networks in our society. And I think everything we know about how to build coherence has to start with trust. So that's especially his two recent papers he wrote about church-based commerce and what have you. The thing I read between the lines was, wait a minute, this might actually work because of the heightened strength of the pre-existing trust network.
Mm-hmm. But that's adjacent to the second point that I meant about the communal binding. But
right.
So the big can of worms to open would be that question, right? What would be a non-religious, so the old John Vervaeke track, the religion without a religion track? What would that actually look like based on the experiences that he's now made inside of the religion? So that would to me be a first. And the second one would be, as I'm looking into the scary and but unfortunately extremely likely possibility of a bust scenario of humanity in the second half of the century, and us going back down to 1-2 billion people. What is there some, in this horrible scenario, is there some opportunity to maintain it's the important infrastructure that we have collectively articulated in the form of learnings out of the boom phase, right? So we've built all of that. We saw what works, what doesn't work, but we haven't been able to implement it. Can we somehow build structures that survive the bust so that the next phase of humanity will inherit that knowledge and not have to start from scratch all over again? That's the only slight little chance that I still see.
Interesting. Of course, from science fiction, that was the purpose of the Foundation in Asimov's Foundation trilogy.
Right.
They had calculated that the crash was coming. How much can we preserve? That's an interesting question.
So it's basically the role of the first foundation, right? The role of the first foundation was to set up a library essentially, and what might that look like? So what's exactly that's an interesting question, given that the probability of us doing the right things at the right time in the right sequence becomes increasingly unlikely with every day that passes, and we don't have a lot of time left.
It doesn't feel like we're on the right track by any means.
No.
The other question I want to ask Jordan in particular, but some of the other people will have some input who are going to be at this thing, is why have all the things we've all tried failed, right? Jordan's been involved in at least 4 attempts to build on the ground communities, all of which failed. And part of it was bad decisions about location and land use rules and things of that sort. Some of it was internal conflicts that weren't well managed. And of course, our old favorite, insufficient funding. Seem to be the 3, but I like to get his perspectives on sort of what are the rank orders of these failure modes, and what does he now think about the possibility of, to your first point, creating something analogous to church type trust networks and coherence in a secular modality.
Mm-hmm.
But start with the failure modes first, because those are often where we get our greatest learnings.
But to me, those seem quite obvious, right? It's a lack of any form of actual power, and there needs to be some consistency and duration of implementation. You said it yourself about building building that piece of software, right? If you need to have some way to run enough experiments until you start succeeding sufficiently to cross over. And that kind of power doesn't exist. I don't see it.
Yeah,
I mean,
and,
that's
and a
ultimately,
few little small standalone projects of 25 people aren't going to do it. Very
so
unlikely.
the question that comes out of that is maybe what makes it so difficult for people who are generally aligned, right? Saying, okay, we're looking at the same kind of summit, we're looking at the same thing up there, but we refuse to collaborate getting there because we are too convinced of our own specific implementation, right? And figuring out what is the failure mode around that? How can the coordination and coherence around let's go build this one thing in as a joint effort and not everybody builds their own little soup? How could this be cracked? That would be super interesting.
All right. That's actually a very interesting topic for my next call here in 2 minutes
Hmm.
with Peter Wang, who
Oh,
has long been interested in building the Game B InfoSphere.